slide. Calibrating the level of risk to the level of review to the level of risk. Next slide. These are just outlines, so next slide. First of all, we're going to maintain the requirement that if the research or any component of the research is greater than minimal risk, it can only be reviewed and approved by a convened IRB at a regular meeting. So that's not going to change. All of this only affects minimum risk research, okay? The proposed change is that, as you know, when we review and approve a protocol, we are restricted by the regulations to give approval of no more than 1 calendar year. If the research goes beyond that calendar year, we are required to re-review that proposal, including any changes or updates that the researcher has provided, and then decide whether or not it can go forward for a second year or a third or a fourth. But there's a minimum annual review required. It's called continuing review. And everybody has to apply. And if you don't apply and get it reviewed before your initial approval expires, then there's a lapse in approval, and that's non-compliance with regulations, and that has to be written up and files kept and all of that. Well, there's two things that they think really need desperate fixing. One, if it's a clinical trial and the only activity of the research that remains is data analysis or routine follow-up clinically for things that people would be getting anyway, even if they weren't in the research, we don't need to do continuing review. If that's it, data analysis or routine clinical follow-up, no continuing review any longer required. If it was initially reviewed and approved under one of the expedited categories, no continuing review. So once you're approved for that research project in perpetuity. Now you're still required to let the IRB know if you make any changes or if you have any adverse events or unexpected problems, but other than those, you're good to go on your own. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Currently, things are eligible, research activities are eligible for expedited review that's informed by an existing list of allowable activities. That's the 9 categories. Their concern is this list is too narrow and it's out of date. So they propose to create a federal panel that will revise those categories and will be a standing panel so that that revision and updating will be an ongoing event. Every year, every 2 years, they'll look and see, are these adequate? Do we need to change the expedited categories? So that'll be a more sensitive kind of way to decide what level of review is required. And that's all that says. Next. Expedited review is allowed if all the activities appear on the list of eligible research and the study is found to be no more than minimal risk. Problem is, as has happened with HIPAA, as this lady just mentioned, different IRBs interpret whether it's eligible for expedited review or not differently. And so what they want to do for the expedited categories is clarify with more specific language and illustrations and examples exactly what kinds of activities are in each of the categories for expedited review. Second thing is, if it's expedited, as we said, it falls under the full Code of Federal Regulations. And the Code of Federal Regulations under Subpart 111 lists all the things that you have to look at as the criteria for review. And they said, yeah, but come on, it's expedited, it means it's minimal risk. Do you really need that level of examination? You have to consider all of those things. And their proposal is, no, you can shorten that list. You only have to look at a few of those things. And so one of the proposals is, which ones should we keep and which ones should we let go for expedited minimal risk research? Continuing review is required for all approved studies. Is that necessary? And they basically say, no, probably not. If it qualifies under the new version of expedited review, it doesn't need continuing review. It can just go on. But they do say, now notice that what will not change is the PI's responsibility to report to the IRB and get approval for any proposed changes and proper notification of unexpected problems and adverse events. Those two things are not going to change. But other than that, if you get approved today for an expedited protocol and that's a 20-year study, we may never hear from you for 20 years, and even then. And so we don't know whether you're still doing it. We don't know how many people have been enrolled. We don't know anything unless what you decide to tell us having to do with either problems or changes. We typically submit the same documents for IRV review as well as for expedited. The proposal is, let's look at creating some templates for protocols and consent forms with sample versions that are specifically designed for use in the most common types of expedited review studies. So these could be surveys or focus groups, observation studies, a variety of different things. The feds are trying to help everybody by coming up with standardized language or standardized forms so that everybody would be able to use the same kind of communication tool, both in talking with participants and in talking with the IRB to get review and approval. And the IRBs would see the same forms coming over and over, and they just look at the specific content differences, as opposed to the widely varying forms of proposals that we get now. Next.